Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Now we drift gently from symbolism into something a little more grounded. Still quiet, still slow, still comfortably sleep. But now we loosen the soil around the scientific side of all this. For thousands of years, people told stories about muddy resets because they saw the effects around them. Today, scientists look at the same layers and conclude somewhat reluctantly, with charts in hand, that the ancient storytellers weren't imagining things. The planet has cycles. Floods have scales. Mud has moods. And civilizations really have been erased by forces so patient that most people at the time barely noticed until it was too late. This part will settle into geology, climate cycles, environmental change, and the soft-spoken ways nature rearranges human life. Think of it as lying back and letting science whisper old truths at a gentle pace without any dramatic drum rolls. The earth doesn't hurry, and neither will we. Let's begin with the simplest foundation, sediment. If you scoop a handful of river mud, you're holding history. Tiny pieces of stone, dust blown across continents, decayed plants. The remains of small organisms, everything mixed together in a quiet archive. When rivers overflow, they deposit these sediments across floodplains. When storms batter coasts, they rearrange shorelines grain by grain. When mountain snow melts, rivers swell and drag silt down with them. The world is constantly reshaped by water carrying mud from one place to another. Geologists call these deposits stratified layers, and they study them the way historians study documents. A thick band of fine silt might reveal a major flood. A layer of sand atop clay could signal a rapid shift in river behavior. A sudden change in color from dark organic soil to pale mineral sediment might indicate drought or migration or abandonment. Ancient people saw these layers with their own eyes whenever they dug into the earth. They didn't need modern scientific terms, because the landscape explained itself. Mud meant something had ended. Fresh soil meant something new had begun. Now, let's drift slowly toward the big cycles, the ones that took centuries or millennia to unfold. Scientists now understand that climate has never been stable. Rainfall shifts. Rivers migrate. Sea levels rise and fall. The planet breathes, in a sense, with cycles that affect every inch of land, one of the most powerful forces shaping ancient civilizations, was the periodic shift in rainfall known as the monsoon cycle. Regions like the Indus Valley relied on predictable rains. When the cycle gradually changed over a few hundred years, not abruptly, the rivers feeding their cities weakened. What had once been fertile land became dusty. Mud flowed less often, meaning fields became harder to farm. And when floods did occur, they were erratic and damaging. People slowly moved away, not because of a dramatic disaster, but because the land stopped cooperating. To ancient people, these changes looked like the world itself was tired. A reset myth made perfect sense. You would look at the abandoned fields and assume the previous age had failed and a new one would eventually rise. From a modern perspective, we see long-term climate change. From an ancient perspective, it was a cosmic shift, a new chapter introduced by water and earth. Let's move gently to another major force, rising sea levels. After the last ice age, melting glaciers raised ocean levels significantly. Many coastal settlements, now underwater, were likely thriving communities. Over generations, people watched the shoreline move inland, swallowing fields and homes. Not quickly, not apocalyptically, just quietly. A slow invasion of water that brought mud and reshaped the landscape. Today, underwater archaeology finds remnants of these lost coast stone tools, pottery fragments, even sections of walls. Ancient myths about lands disappearing beneath the waves begin to feel less symbolic and more observational. In Southeast Asia, enormous areas of land that once connected islands are now under the sea. Indigenous stories speak of ancient migrations caused by rising waters. In some traditions, the world was smaller in the old days and gradually became larger as oceans rose, when in reality, the opposite was true. It's a reminder that ancient memory was often preserved in metaphor rather than precise. Measurements, another scientific factor behind muddy resets, is river avulsion. This is when a major river, instead of following its usual path, abruptly changes course. Abruptly here means over decades or a few centuries, which is the geological equivalent of casually stepping to the side. When a river shifts, entire cities can be left without access to water. Others can suddenly find themselves underwater. The city of Mohenjo-Daro likely suffered from shifts like this. Its iconic wells and baths were designed for a specific water system. When that system changed, the city could no longer function. Ancient people interpreted these shifts not as random events, but as cosmic decisions. A river abandoning a city felt personal, almost like a divine gesture. Modern hydrology sees it as sediment buildup, pressure gradients, and riverbed erosion. But emotionally, both explanations capture the same sense of inevitability. One of the most dramatic examples of river avulsion comes from the Yellow River in China. Known as China's Sorrow, it changed course many times throughout history, sometimes flooding land with thick layers of yellow silt. Entire regions were buried in mud deep enough to hide previous settlements. Some resets were peaceful. Some were devastating. All fed into the long-held belief that the world goes through cycles governed by water. Now let's drift toward the Mediterranean, where geology played its own quiet game. The region experienced earthquakes, volcanic activity, coastline changes, and long-term shifts in rainfall patterns. Over centuries, these changes accumulated into conditions that forced communities to relocate. Some cities repeatedly rebuilt in the same place. Others were forgotten entirely. The famous Bronze Age collapse, slow unraveling of several ancient civilizations, had many causes, including droughts and migrations influenced by environmental change. Mud and sediment from this era reveal abandoned farms, dried-up rivers, and coastlines that shifted dramatically. To ancient historians, these changes felt like the end of an age. Modern geology, however, sees the patient shaping of the Mediterranean's climate. But both conclusions share the same gentle tone. The world changes, and people must adapt. Now we drift toward the Americas. In North America, vast regions experienced periodic megafloods at the end of the Ice Age. These floods carved landscapes, moved huge amounts of sediment, and left behind geological scars that modern researchers still study. Indigenous traditions in the region preserve stories of great waters rising and reshaping the land. They don't describe these events with drama. They describe them as part of the natural world's rhythm. Farther south, the Amazon basin has a long history of river expansion and contraction. Some areas were once dry enough for large settlements. Later, these lands became wetlands. Mud preserved traces of these societies, but the people moved on. Their descendants remembered the shifts as ancient resets, times when the world became too wet or too dry and humanity had to start fresh. In coastal Peru, environmental change also shaped civilization. The shifting behavior of the Humboldt current influenced rainfall, river flow, and food supply. El Niño events brought sudden floods followed by long droughts. These alternating cycles left layers of mud that archaeologists still find today. Ancient Andean myths speak of earlier ages ending in floodsa, calm recognition of natural patterns. Now, let's drift quietly into the role of volcanic mudflows, known as lahars. Though more abrupt than ordinary mud deposition, lahars are still slow compared to explosions or earthquakes. They move like thick rivers of wet concrete, burying everything in their path. Famous examples include the ancient city beneath Indonesia's Mount Merapi and settlements buried near the slopes of Ecuador's volcanoes. Many indigenous myths describe earlier worlds swallowed by moving earth. Scientists point to lahars. Ancient people saw them as resets. But the most interesting intersection of science and myth appears when we look at soil horizons, the layers created by slow, long-term processes. These layers often reveal periods of intense farming, periods of abandonment, periods of erosion, periods of flooding. Ancient people didn't need microscopes to interpret these changes. They simply looked at the land and noticed when it behaved differently from before. When fields turned to mud for multiple seasons, it meant the world was changing. When river patterns shifted, it meant the age of that land was ending. When new soil appeared, darker or lighter or thicker than the last, it meant the next age was beginning. One could say ancient people did field geology without realizing it. Their conclusions just had different language. Something modern science confirms quite gently is that civilizations almost always fail slowly. Not with dramatic endings, not with sudden destruction, but with small shifts accumulating over time. A few bad harvests, a river changing course, mud accumulating where it shouldn't, people leaving, houses emptying, silence settling, and finally, the land reclaiming everything. Science caused this gradual environmental pressure. Ancient people called it the world beginning again. Both perspectives fit comfortably side by side. One idea rises slowly through the soil. Ancient reset myths align with geological reality not because myths predicted science, but because ancient observers watched nature carefully. They lived in a world where earth, water, and sky were their textbooks. When the world reset, they saw it. When mud buried a city, they accepted it. When new soil formed, they rebuilt. Civilizations rise. Civilizations are buried. Civilizations are remembered for a while, and eventually they become layers in the ground. Now we drift into one of the softest layers of this entire story, how civilizations rebuilt themselves after resets. Not in dramatic bursts of triumph, but slowly, steadily, with the patient rhythm of people who wake up after a long season of floods and decide, quite sensibly, to start putting things back together. Human resilience is often described as heroic, but in reality it's usually quiet, practical, and slightly tired. Early civilizations didn't emerge from mud with fanfare. They emerged with baskets, tools, and a long sigh of acceptance in this part. We explore how new cultures grew on top of the buried old ones, how traditions changed after each reset, how memories softened, and how societies used mud, both real and symbolic, to rebuild their worlds. The process wasn't quick. It wasn't clean, but it was constant, and in that constancy lies the gentle rhythm of human history. Let's begin with the simplest rebuilding tool, memory. After a civilization was buried or abandoned, the next generation inherited fragment stories, objects, half-remembered rituals, and sometimes ruins peeking through layers of earth. These fragments shaped their new identity. They weren't starting from zero. They were starting from whatever survived. This survival often included very practical things: knowledge of crops, water management, seasonal rhythms. But it also included beliefs about why the earlier world had ended. In ancient Mesopotamia, when people rebuilt cities after a major flood, they often placed new foundations directly on top of older ones. This was partly practical. The ground was already leveled, and partly symbolic. Building on older walls meant inheriting the legacy of the previous age. The early Akkadians, Sumerians, and later Babylonian communities created multi-layered cities like geological sculptures. Each generation added its own thickness to the stack. Archaeologists later peeled these layers apart like pages, seeing how each reset shaped new cultural habits. Imagine a family returning to their ancestral site after a destructive flood season. They stand on soil several hands higher than their grandparents ever walked on. They build their new house without realizing that beneath their feet lies another house, once filled with pottery, tools, and the quiet sounds of other lives. As they work, they pick up odd objects from the soil-broken bowls, clay figurines, maybe a seal carved with old symbols. These objects become part of their understanding of the past. They connect the new world to the old one. But memory is unreliable. Over time, the purpose of the object fades, and only the feeling remains. Myths tend to grow from such feelings. Now we drift east again, to the Indus Valley, after environmental shifts and flooding forced people to abandon their cities. The next groups who came through the region found remnants of a civilization with carefully planned streets and advanced drainage systems. They didn't always understand what they were looking at, but the presence of these ruins influenced how later communities viewed the land. Some believed the old cities had been abandoned by earlier races. Others believed they had been swallowed by divine waters. Over time, what remained was the feeling that the land had once been home to something larger, something that had ended and allowed new life to rise. Even without written myths, the ruins told their own quiet story. Rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was cultural. When people faced reset slow collapses caused by rivers shifting, soil changing, or climate drifting, they adapted their rituals and beliefs. Many festivals around the world today began as celebrations of survival, marking the return of floodwaters, the arrival of fertile soil, or the rebuilding of homes. Take the annual flooding of the Nile. Egyptian culture turned this phenomenon into a cosmic event. The flood wasn't an inconvenience. It was a divine gift. Festivals marked its arrival, rituals honored the returning waters, and priests used this moment to remind people of the world's cyclical nature. Without mud, there would be no life. Without floods, there would be no renewal. By connecting rebuilding to cosmic cycles, Egyptians transformed practical survival into spiritual resilience. In China, after major floods or river shifts, communities rebuilt with strong moral narratives. Philosophers saw environmental resets as reflections of human behavior. If a dynasty collapsed after a series of floods, It confirmed that the rulers had lost their mandate of heaven. Rebuilding became not just an engineering task, but a moral project. New rulers emphasized justice, harmony, and ordered, at least at first, because the reset offered a chance to restore balance. Mud symbolized both the failure of the old order and the fertile material of the new one. In Mesoamerica, resets shaped calendars, rituals, and worldviews. The Maya imagined previous worlds destroyed by floods or other natural forces. These cycles were embedded into their long count calendar. When cities were rebuilt after environmental changes, people understood themselves as living in a new age, distinct from the last. Even the architecture reflected this. New temples were often built atop old ones, symbolizing continuity through renewal. Let's drift slowly to Southeast Asia. In regions like what is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, communities built raised houses and canal networks precisely because earlier settlements had been damaged by flooding. These adaptations became cultural norms. Even today, homes in many riverine areas sit on stilts, reflecting thousands of years of learning from resets. Mythology and engineering intertwined. People believed that water periodically reclaimed the land, so they designed their homes to coexist with that rhythm. Rebuilding was not seen as an attempt to overcome nature, but as an attempt to cooperate with it. But what about the emotional side of rebuilding? Ancient texts and oral traditions suggest that people rarely viewed resets as tragedies. They saw them as transitions. After all, when a flood buries your home and leaves behind a smooth, fertile layer of earth, the land practically encourages you to start again. Mud doesn't just erase, it prepares. This practical optimism shows up in myths where survivors of floods plant seeds immediately after the waters recede. It appears in stories of ancestors who rebuild not out of desperation, but out of patience. Now, let's look at how resets shaped architecture. Civilizations that experienced repeated flooding learned to build differently. In Mesopotamia, buildings gradually elevated their floors over time. Each rebuilding phase added a new layer on top of the previous one. Over centuries, some temples became tall platform structures simply because each generation added a fresh layer of mud brick. These artificial hills were later perceived as sacred mounds, echoes of mythic primordial hills emerging from water. Architecture became a memory, physically recording each reset through construction choices. In the Andes, people built terraces along mountain slopes to control water and soil. These terraces were not just agricultural tools. They were cultural responses to repeated environmental resets. Myths of earlier ages washed away by waters encouraged communities to build higher, stronger, and more intelligently. The stonework we admire today is a product not of sudden genius, but of long lessons accumulated through resets. Across the African continent, similar patterns appear. Communities near major rivers, like the Niger or the Nile, built storage systems and seasonal housing structures that acknowledged the inevitability of flooding. Flood myths from the region rarely express fear. Instead, they reflect understanding. The world changes shape, and humans shift with it. Rebuilding became part of life, a steady rhythm like planting and harvesting. Now, let's drift into the idea of cultural blending after resets. When a civilization declines due to environmental pressures, it rarely disappears entirely. People migrate. They join other groups. They intermarry, share stories, and introduce their customs. This blending creates new cultures with layered identities, much like the soil beneath them. Myths from one group merge with myths from another. Rituals evolve. Languages borrow words. The reset becomes a moment of creative fusion. For example, the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations in the Mediterranean didn't wipe out the people. It reshaped trade routes, shifted populations, and encouraged the mixing of traditions. New cultures emerged from the fragments of old ones. They carried memories of earlier resets and added new interpretations. Myths of ancient floods, disappearing islands, and buried cities became shared narratives across wide regions. Similar blending occurred in South Asia after the decline of the Harappan cities. People moved eastward and southward, joining agricultural communities and influencing languages, pottery styles, and beliefs. The idea of earlier worlds destroyed by water likely traveled with them, becoming part of the region's cultural memory. One of the most peaceful examples comes from the Pacific Islands. After destructive storms or rising waters forced communities to move, they carried stories of earlier homelands now submerged. These stories were not told with sorrow. They were told with acceptance. The ocean takes and gives. The people travel and rebuild. This cycle shaped the beautiful navigation traditions of the region. If the world resets by water, then humans must learn the paths of the waves. Now let's drift into ritual. After resets, many societies created ceremonies to mark new beginnings. Some planted sacred trees symbolizing renewal. Others built altars on newly exposed soil. Some cleansed their homes with water, symbolically mimicking the cosmic flood. Others used mud figurines or clay pots to represent old worlds that had dissolved. These rituals served as gentle reminders that life moves in cycles. In parts of Africa, initiation rituals for young adults included references to earlier ages that had sunk, meaning they had ended. The new generation symbolically emerged from the mud of childhood into the solid ground of adulthood. Myths of resets weren't just cosmic explanations. They were part of the personal journey in early Europe. Seasonal festivals marking winter's end and spring's beginning echoed the same symbolism. Land sleeping under frost, returning to life when the soil softened. The idea of the earth waking up parallels reset myths, though expressed through climate rather than floods. Now, let's explore how resets affected the transmission of knowledge. When a civilization is pressured by environmental change, priorities shift. Some forms of knowledge fade. Others become extremely important. For example, agricultural techniques evolve. Water management becomes essential. New building materials are developed. Old texts are recopied or reinterpreted. A reset forces societies to reassess what matters. In some cases, this results in technological progress. In others, knowledge is lost for centuries. Mud preserves objects, but it doesn't preserve everything. Wooden tools rot. Oral traditions shift. Writing disappears if no one continues it. This selective preservation shapes how new cultures think about old ones. When they uncover ruins, they interpret them through their own worldview. One object might become a sacred relic. Another might be seen as a sign of divine punishment. Another might become the center of a myth about a lost race. In this way, rebuilding is not simply about reconstructing buildings. It's about reconstructing meaning. Now we drift into the gentle psychological impact of resets. People who survive environmental shifts often view the world differently. They become more aware of change, of impermanence, of the fragility of life. Ancient texts show hints of this mindset: thoughts about humility, patience, and the passage of time. There is something grounding about living in a place where the earth itself rearranges your life. It encourages adaptability and an almost philosophical calm. One final idea rises softly toward the end of this part. Resets create traditions, and traditions create identity. After each environmental change, people rebuilt not just their homes, but their understanding of themselves. They adopted new symbols, new rituals, new names for gods, new stories about why the old world ended. Over time, these stories became the foundation of culture. Civilizations may fall quietly under mud, but they rise just as quietly through memory, ritual, and reconstruction. Now we drift into one of the widest, calmest territories of this entire story. How reset myths traveled across the world, appearing again and again among cultures that had no direct contact with each other. It's one of those quiet historical patterns that doesn't shout for attention. Instead, it hums softly in the background, the way river water hums beneath a bridge. You can ignore it if you wish, but once you listen closely, it becomes clear that humanity has been whispering similar stories about beginnings and endings for thousands of years. In this part, we settle into that global murmuring. We'll move slowly continent to continent and watch how different societies imagined earlier worlds washed away. How they described the strange silence after the flood, and how the mud beneath their feet shaped the way they saw themselves. The similarities are gentle but unmistakable, like different people humming the same tune without realizing it. Let's begin in the broad region stretching from the Middle East to the Mediterranean. We've already wandered around Mesopotamia and Egypt, but now we look at how their ideas spread outward. Mesopotamian traders carried flood stories along caravan routes. Sailors carried them across the sea. Farmers retold them to neighbors, who retold them to travelers, who eventually retold them to people who had never even seen the rivers that inspired those stories. By the time the Greeks heard these tales, they had already evolved into new forms. The Greek flood of Deucalion resembles the older Near Eastern myths in structure, but it adapted to local geography. Instead of vast river plains, the Greek landscape offered mountains and coastlines. Their flood myth describes people scrambling to the high ground and the subsequent repeopling of the world with stones in unusual choice. Though, to be fair, Greece has more stones than mud. The Greeks kept the core idea. The world resets, humans begin again, and civilization rises from the remnants. From Greece, similar stories drifted into neighboring regions. Some Mediterranean islands preserved tales of earlier ages swallowed by water, sometimes linked to tsunamis, sometimes to local floods, sometimes to memories of settlements lost along shifting coastlines. These stories weren't dramatic epics. They were simple explanations told by families who found pottery shards on the beach or who lived near hills that everyone insisted had once been towns. As we move northward, into ancient Europe, we begin to see patterns that echo the same structure. Many Celtic and Germanic traditions speak of earlier worlds destroyed by water, storms, or the sea reclaiming land. These weren't framed as punishments. They were framed as inevitabilities. The land changes shape. People move. Life continues. In some traditions, the world had to be washed clean before new people arrived. In others, the earlier age simply slipped away, leaving behind mysterious ruins and half-buried stones that puzzled later generations. In Scandinavia, even though the geography is different, there are myths describing countless earlier ages, some of which ended by water. The Norse sagas describe cycles of creation and destruction, punctuated by floods that washed the world between eras. The world tree remained, but everything around it changed. Mud and water symbolized the soft reset between cosmic chapters. Now we drift east again, but farther this time. In Central Asia, among nomadic cultures whose lives moved with the rhythm of the seasons. Stories of earlier worlds appear in calm, steady patterns. Many of these groups lived along rivers that frequently changed course. When the land shifted, they simply moved to better pastures. Their myths reflect this quiet adaptability. Some told of a great flood that once covered the plains, leaving only mountaintops exposed. Others spoke of earlier tribes washed away, with new ones emerging from survivors who drifted on floating debris or climbed high ridges. These stories weren't moral lessons. They were observations softened into narrative. Now, let's continue to China, where the Great Flood myth plays a central role in early mythology. But what makes China's case unique is that the flood wasn't imagined as a sudden cataclysm. It lasted generations slow, widespread, and quietly devastating. This matches the geological record of long-term flooding in ancient China. Myths describe the hero guiding the waters into channels, not fighting them, not pushing them back, but redirecting them with patience. The world resets gently in these myths. Civilization is not smothered. It is reshaped. These Chinese ideas didn't stay in one place. They moved along early trade routes, mixing with stories from Central Asia and influencing later folklore across East Asia. We find echoes in Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia floods that washed away earlier worlds, saved by one or two survivors, and repopulated through new generations. These myths rarely involve rage or punishment. They reflect landscapes shaped by monsoons, river overflows, and quiet accumulations of silt. As we drift into Southeast Asia, flood stories become even more common. Local rivers, swollen by seasonal rains, produced mud layers that turned valleys into temporary lakes. Communities rebuilt again and again. The myths from Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam speak of earlier lands swallowed by water, of people escaping to hilltops, and of new worlds emerging once the mud dried. These stories were passed through rice farming communities that understood water intimately. To them, the flood wasn't a disaster. It was a normal part of life that occasionally got out of hand. Now we slow our pace and move south toward Australia. Aboriginal stories, some preserved through oral tradition for thousands of years, describe earlier worlds lost to rising seas. These stories correspond astonishingly well to geological reconstructions of post-Ice Age sea level rise. Some regions that are now underwater were once dry landscapes populated by early peoples. As the sea rose, it covered their hunting grounds and campsites. The myths explain this process calmly. The land drowned, people moved, new worlds formed. There is little drama in these stories, just acceptance. Next we drift toward the Pacific Islands, where flood and reset myths form a strong cultural thread. For island communities, the sea is both neighbor and teacher. Many traditions describe earlier ages when the ocean rose and consumed land. In some myths, people fled to higher islands. In others, only a few individuals survived on trees or rafts. But unlike many apocalyptic myths from other parts of the world, Pacific versions often lack fear. They read like travel narratives. The sea shifted. People followed. Life continued. Now we cross the ocean toward the Americas. On the Pacific coast of South America, Andean communities told stories about earlier worlds destroyed by floods. These myths tie neatly into the region's climatic cycles. The Andes experience periodic flooding caused by El Niño events, slow, strong, and muddy. Entire valleys could flood, leaving behind flattened fields topped with thick layers of sediment. Myth and environment match in the gentlest way. Among Amazonian societies, flood stories appear frequently. Some describe earlier worlds washed away when the great river rose beyond its usual boundaries. Others speak of land animals scrambling to higher ground. These stories were shaped by realities the people lived with. The Amazon basin is a land that floods annually, swelling into lakes and wet forests before receding. A large enough flood could create what felt like a new world. For communities living in such landscapes, a reset myth was simply a logical explanation for drastic changes. As we drift northward, we encounter the rich array of North American indigenous traditions. Many tribes have flood myths, though each with its own personality. Some describe a great canoe holding survivors. Others tell of a raft made from logs. Some describe a single mountaintop that remained dry. Others portray the world as a vast sea with only sky and water until land re-emerged. These myths reflect local environments perfectly. Coastal tribes focus on rising waters. River communities describe muddy. Mountain tribes emphasize high ground and survival. The common theme is calm inevitability. The world was covered in water once, so it may be again. This wasn't frightening. It was part of the world's rhythm. Now we drift gently to Mesoamerica. Here, the flood myth takes on one of its most poetic forms. The Maya believed in cycles of creation, each one ending in destruction. One age was destroyed by a flood that returned everything to mud. The earlier humans dissolved because they were weak, made of earth that couldn't hold its form. Later humans were made of maize, a better material, more suited to the world. This layering of creation is deeply symbolic, but it also responds to the region's environmental behavior. Seasonal rains, hurricane-driven floods, and dense mud flows shaped the landscape. Myths adapted accordingly. The Aztec version is similar but more dramatic, though still calm in its own way. They believed earlier worlds had ended in 4 great cycles. One of these, the Son of Water, destroyed humanity with floods. A few people survived by transforming into fish or climbing to the top of a giant tree. The reset was complete. One world buried, another beginning. Now we cross to the Caribbean. Many island cultures preserve stories of earlier lands submerged beneath the waves. These myths often serve as explanations for underwater features, ridges, or formations that resemble human structures. Whether or not these observations were tied to ancient sea level rise, the stories show how reset ideas drifted naturally into local beliefs. As we float across the Atlantic to West Africa, we find another region with rich flood traditions. In some myths, the world was initially covered in water. God or the spirits lowered land from the sky. In others, earlier worlds ended in great floods that reshaped everything. The Niger River, with its periodic expansions, certainly encouraged these narratives. When the river flooded, it deposited thick layers of silt across farmlands. When it receded, it left behind fertile soil. Another reset, another beginning. People adapted. Myths grew. Farther inland, in the Sahel, older myths describe environments that were once wetter and greener. Archaeology confirms this. The Sahara was not always a desert. It once held lakes, rivers, and thriving human settlements. When climate shifted, these lands dried. Communities moved southward. They carried stories about earlier worlds lost to environmental change. These weren't flood myths in the literal sense, but they fit the same pattern. The world resets, the land changes shape. Humans begin again. As we drift across these continents, a soothing pattern emerges. Nearly every region, no matter how separate, produced some form of reset myth. And while the details vary, the tone remains familiar. Soft, observational, accepting. The world changes. Mud buries things. Water rises and falls. Civilization adapts. What makes these global parallels so fascinating is how natural and unforced they feel. It's tempting to assume that flood myths spread from one culture to another. Sometimes they did, through trade and migration. But just as often, similar environments produced similar stories independently. A river valley prone to flooding will inspire myths about worlds washed away. A coastline shaped by rising seas will inspire myths about sunken lands. A floodplain dotted with buried settlements will inspire myths about forgotten ages. Reset myths, in other words, are the Earth's quiet footprints across human imagination. Now let's drift gently into how global overlaps reveals something about human thought itself. Despite cultural differences, people everywhere seem to see the world through cycles. Day and night, seasons, the rise and fall of rivers, the growth and decay of crops, the birth and death of generations. Everything repeats. Everything returns to its beginning. Reset myths are simply the cosmic version of these observations. They take familiar patterns and apply them to the entire world. The land floods, so the world floods. The river buries your field in mud, so perhaps it once buried the whole earth. The soil brings new life after the flood, so perhaps the world itself was created from mud. These parallels don't mean that all myths come from one origin. They mean human beings everywhere noticed the same things, felt the same rhythms, and shaped their stories accordingly. We drift into a broader reflection. Reset myths are global not because they spread from one storyteller to another, but because the earth itself behaves in global ways. Water rises. Land sinks. Rivers wander. Seas grow. Mud buries. Civilizations respond with resilience and imagination. Now we drift into one of the softest and most inward-looking layers of this story, the psychological meaning of resets. Until now, we've moved through landscapes, archaeology, geology, and global myths. But beneath all of that lies something quieter, the human mind trying to understand why the world behaves the way it does. People didn't create reset myths just to explain floods or ruins. They created them to explain themselves, to make sense of fear, change, time, memory, and the unsettling fact that nothing stays where we put it. Not even whole civilizations. So in this part, we'll take a calm walk through the emotional terrain of ancient people. Not dramatic emotions, those would wake us up too much, but the kind of slow, reflective thoughts that creep in during long nights. The kind of thinking you do when you watch a river rise, or when you find an old pot buried in your field, or when your grandparents tell you stories about how the land looked different in their youth. Reset myths emerged from moments like that, from questions people whispered when the world felt too big to understand. Let's begin with a simple truth. People like patterns. We take comfort in knowing what comes next. Sunrise, sunset, rainy season, dry season, planting, harvesting. Life teaches us that everything repeats. And when something breaks, the pattern when the river floods more than expected, or the land sinks, or a city is abandoned. People look for new patterns. To make sense of the disruption, reset myths provided those patterns. They offered a large-scale version of the cycles people already lived with. If fields die and revive each year, perhaps the world does the same. If villages rise and fall, perhaps humanity does the same. If rivers erase farms and leave fertile soil behind, perhaps earlier worlds were erased and replaced too. Reset myths weren't frightening. They were comforting. They told people that change was not random. It was part of a larger rhythm. Even destruction had meaning. Let's sink a little deeper into this quiet psychology. Imagine being an ancient farmer living near a river. You watch the river every year. Sometimes it behaves well. Sometimes it decides to deposit half a mountain's worth of silt on your property. You don't complain. Well, maybe you complain a little, but mostly you observe. You notice that the river doesn't seem to care about your plans. It has its own timeline, older and slower than yours. Now imagine someone older telling you that long ago the river rose even higher, that it covered everything, that the world began again from that muddy silence. Whether or not the story is literally true doesn't matter. It feels true because the river behaves like something that could do it, this feeling that the world is both fragile and cyclical became part of how ancient people understood themselves. Now, let's drift toward the concept of memory. Humans forget things quickly. Whole generations vanish in a century. Languages change. Stories shift. When people dug into the earth and found remains from earlier ages, they realized their memory was unreliable. The land remembered more than they did. That realization can be quietly humbling. It encourages a philosophical view. If the world forgets us eventually, then we must accept that permanence is an illusion. Reset myths soften that truth. They turned forgetting into renewal. Instead of saying everything is lost, they said everything begins again. It's a small psychological difference, but it makes life feel less arbitrary. If the world resets, then erasure isn't erasure, it's preparation. Now we drift toward another quiet, emotional layer, meaning. Humans like to attach purpose to events. When natural disasters occurred, ancient people rarely believed they were random. They saw them as signs, reminders, or transitions. Floods didn't just happen, they meant something. They signaled the end of an age or the start of a new one. This wasn't superstition. It was a way to stay calm in the face of uncertainty. If disaster has meaning, then survival has meaning too. Reset myths reassured people that they were part of a story larger than themselves. Humans also had a very practical, emotional reason for believing in resets: continuity. The idea that earlier worlds existed made the present world feel less lonely. People like to imagine predecessors walking the same land, dealing with the same problems, leaving traces behind. Even if those earlier people were washed away by a flood, their existence created a sense of historical depth, and depth creates identity. Now we drift gently into fear, not dramatic fear, but the soft, quiet kind that sits under the surface. Ancient people feared losing control. They feared the unpredictability of nature. Floods, mudslides, droughts, these events reminded them that they weren't the main characters in the story of the world. Reset myths helped soften that fear by embedding change into a predictable pattern. If the world resets periodically, then environmental chaos feels less personal. It becomes part of the Earth's natural cycle. not a punishment or a threatening mystery. Now let's drift toward a different psychological benefit: hope. Reset myths are, strangely, optimistic. They say, even when everything seems lost, the world returns. Life comes back. Mud dries. Seeds sprout. New generations build new worlds from the old. This mindset helped people cope with collapse. If your village floods or your crops fail, you can frame it as part of a larger cosmological rhythm rather than a final end. The Maya carried this idea deeply. They saw each world age as temporary. When one ended, another began. This worldview absorbed fear and transformed it into acceptance. Instead of asking, why did this happen? People asked, what comes next? That shift in mindset makes long-term survival psychologically easier. Let's drift now into memory and identity once more, but from a different angle. When a world resets, stories become bridges. Every generation needs a way to connect to the previous ones. Reset myths preserved continuity without requiring perfect historical accuracy. They explained why ancient ruins existed, why landscapes changed, why old objects appeared in strange places, in places where written language didn't exist. Oral tradition filled the role. Myths encoded practical knowledge: where the floodwaters rise, which mountains stay dry, where fertile ground appears afterward. These stories were passed down because they were useful not just spiritually, but physically. Reset myths were survival guides disguised as cosmology. In some societies, like those in the Pacific Islands, flood stories were woven into navigation traditions. People learned which islands submerged during certain seasons, where safe routes existed, how the land changed shape over generations. Myth and geography blended until they were inseparable. Now we drift into the role of resets in shaping social cohesion. When people believe they are living in a new age, after a reset, it creates unity. They share a collective beginning. They see themselves as survivors or inheritors of a new world. This is especially powerful after real disasters. Communities need common narratives to rebuild emotionally as well as physically. Reset myths provided that framework. They told people, we're all in this together. The last age ended. This one is ours. In Japan, after numerous floods, communities created religious traditions to mark renewal. In West Africa, myths about earlier watery worlds shaped initiation rituals and social roles. In South Asia, flood cycles influenced caste duties, agricultural calendars, and temple ceremonies. In each case, the reset idea gave people a shared story. Let's drift slowly into one more gentle psychological theme: humility. Many reset myths teach that humans are temporary but meaningful. We rise from the earth and return to it. Civilizations come and go, but the world endures. That idea encourages a modest relationship with nature. Instead of trying to dominate it, ancient people sought to cooperate with it. They understood that fighting a river is pointless. You adapt. You move your home. You build differently. You make peace with the landscape. This humility is still reflected in cultures that live near unpredictable waters. In Bangladesh, India, parts of China, and Southeast Asia, people accept that land and water trade places. Their architecture, farming, and rituals reflect a thousands-year-old acceptance of natural resets. Modern science calls it resilience. Ancient people called it the way of the world. Now we drift into a serene idea. Resets help people make sense of time. In the modern world, time is a line. In the ancient world, time was a circle, a spiral, a wave. Resets weren't the end. They were a turn in the cycle. This cyclical view is psychologically soothing. It tells people that destruction is part of creation, that loss is part of renewal, and that everything belongs to a larger pattern. Many ancient calendars reflect this belief. The Maya-long count rotates through world ages. The Hindu Ugas follow immense cycles. The Chinese dynastic model assumes rise, decline, downfall, and renewal. Even the seasonal festivals of Europe reflect cycles of death and rebirth. Reset myths were simply the cosmic versions of these everyday rhythms. One final idea settles quietly. Reset myths reveal how deeply human beings need stories to understand the world. Not scientific explanations. Not exact histories. Stories. Gentle narratives that take overwhelming natural forces and fold them into something meaningful. Something manageable. Something human. Floods can destroy. Mud can bury. Climate can shift. Civilizations can fade. But the stories remain, carrying wisdom, memory, fear, hope, and continuity. We've wandered through soft landscapes, buried cities, global myths, scientific explanations, and the quiet psychology behind ancient resets. Now, in this final part, we drift into the gentle closing stretch of the story. Not a dramatic ending, just a long exhale, a settling of dust. The way history often ends, not with a bang, but with the soft sound of soil shifting back into place. This last part brings all the layers together and lets them rest beside each other. The way archaeologists line up pottery shards from different centuries. Nothing rushed, nothing loud, just a calm reflection on why the idea of muddy resets has survived for thousands of years, and why it still feels familiar even now. Let's begin by returning to the ground beneath our feet. We've seen how mud preserves ancient worlds, how it buries them quietly, how it creates the perfect conditions for ruin and memory to sit side by side. Mud is patient. It waits longer than any civilization. It watches people build walls, temples, farms, and entire cities, then silently folds those structures into its layers. It doesn't do this with hostility. It simply does what it has always done, move with water, settle with time. This rhythm shaped ancient myths, but it also shapes the modern world in ways we don't always notice. When we dig foundations for a building, we still uncover older worlds. When we walk across a riverbank after a storm, we still see the layers left behind. When an archaeological team unearths a buried city, it's not just a scientific event, it's a moment when the past quietly taps us on the shoulder and reminds us that the ground remembers more than we do. The idea of a reset is comforting because resets are familiar. The world resets every day when the sun rises. It resets every season. It resets after every storm. Flood myths simply stretch that familiar pattern across time now. Let's drift into how modern people relate to these ancient cycles. We live in a world that feels fast, but the earth moves slowly. Sea levels still rise. Rivers still change course. Coasts erode. Cities sink. None of this is dramatic on a daily basis. It's the same slow, quiet change that ancient people lived with. We've just trained ourselves not to notice it. But every now and then, we're reminded. A storm rearranges a coastline. A river floods a town. An archaeological site reveals a city buried beneath another city. In those moments, even the modern mind slips into ancient thinking. We start to view time differently, not as a line, but as a layered thing, a cycle, a spiral, a gentle loop. Reset myths still resonate because they mirror the way nature behaves. They're not outdated. They're practical. Now we drift toward the idea of continuity, one of the softest themes running through all these myths. Ancient resets were never about total destruction. They always left something behind. A seed, a survivor, a memory, a scrap of architecture, a pattern in the soil. This continuity matters. It tells us that even when civilizations fall, people keep going. They rebuild, they adapt, they reinterpret what came before. Ancient people rarely saw the flood as an ending. They saw it as a transition, a handover between ages. Modern history tends to focus on collapses, fallen empires, abandoned ruins. But the ancient worldview was softer. They didn't fixate on doom. They focused on what came after. The next cycle, the next age, the next mound rising from the mud. Civilizations didn't end. They changed shape. Now let's drift into the cultural legacy of reset myths. Many of these ancient stories influenced later religions, philosophies, and worldviews. The idea of a world washed clean appears in the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and countless indigenous cultures. This doesn't mean all these beliefs copied each other. It means they responded to the same environmental patterns. The same mud, the same water, the same quiet cycles. Religious stories speak of renewal, of worlds ending and beginning, of humanity reborn after destruction. These stories echo the older, simpler myths we've explored. A flood doesn't destroy life. It refreshes it. A muddy world doesn't mean chaos. It means creation is about to happen again. Modern philosophy also echoes this idea. Many thinkers describe history as cyclical. They talk about patterns repeating, about societies rising and falling like tides. This isn't pessimism. It's observation. The world changes shape and humans adjust. Now let's drift deeper into the emotional resonance of resets. People are drawn to stories of the world starting over because it reflects something personal. Every person experiences resets. Childhood ending, new responsibilities beginning. Losing something, gaining something else. Life reshapes itself quietly, just like landscapes do. Mud is not just a physical thing. It's a psychological symbol. The idea that the world can begin again gives people comfort. It tells them that change is survivable. That loss carries the seeds of renewal. That destruction can be gentle. That endings are not final. Ancient people understood this instinctively. They built entire belief systems on it. Their myths taught children not to fear floods, or storms, or the disappearance of old ways. They taught communities to trust the earth's rhythms. They taught people to see themselves as part of something larger and slower. Even today, in times of global uncertainty, people return to stories about cycles, floods, and resets. Not because they want disaster, but because they want reassurance. The world has changed before. It will change again. And people will adapt, rebuild, and reshape it. Now, let's drift toward one of the most calming realizations of this entire narrative. Ancient reset myths survived because they were accurate enough. Not literally accurate. Not in every detail, but emotionally and environmentally accurate. Ancient people saw the world begin again. They saw rivers wipe away fields, then restore them. They saw coastlines shift and forests regrow. They saw cities collapse and new ones rise nearby. They witnessed the same long cycles we still experience today. Reset myths weren't fantasies. They were interpretations. They didn't need divine anger or supernatural drama to make sense. They just needed mud, the soft, unhurried force that buried worlds and preserved them at the same time. Let's drift for a moment into the idea of buried memory. Archaeology shows us that whenever a civilization disappears, it never disappears cleanly. Something remains. A foundation stone, a pot, a tool, a handful of seeds, a piece of a wall, a carving half buried by silt. These fragments remind us that the past is still here, layered beneath the present. When ancient people found these remains, they created myths to explain them. Today, we use science, but emotionally, the effect is the same. We feel connected to earlier worlds. We feel the weight of time beneath our feet. We feel part of a cycle much larger than ourselves. Now let's drift into the final theme, perspective. Reset myths taught ancient people to view the world with humility. They reminded them that humanity is temporary while the earth endures. But they also reminded them that humanity is resilient. That even if the world resets, life continues. New generations rise. New cultures form. New stories emerge. This balance between humility and resilience is the heart of ancient reset myths. It's why they're calming rather than frightening. It's why they feel familiar even now. When we think about the mud that buried civilizations, it's easy to imagine tragedy. But ancient people didn't. They saw transition. They saw preparation. They saw continuity. And that brings us gently to the closing breath of this journey. Reset myths endure not because humans fear destruction, but because humans understand renewal. They understand that the world changes shape, and so do we. They understand that mud buries, but it also preserves. It wipes the slate clean, but it also provides the material for new beginnings. It is both ending and beginning, both memory and forgetting, both destruction and creation. The mud that buried civilizations also protected them. It kept their stories safe. It held their layers in place until someone, centuries later, came along with a brush and a notebook and a sense of wonder. And that is the quiet truth beneath all these myths. The past never disappears. It settles, softly, patiently, waiting for the next age to dig it up and listen. Thank you for drifting through this long, slow journey.